So, anyways, are we ready for our movie of the week?
Yes.
All right, here we go. Alrighty, so what are we talking about this week?
We are diving into, what was it, 1982, 1981? The classic Tron.
Wow, was it that early in the 80s?
It's early 80s. It's either 82 or 81, I want to say. But um, yeah, I mean, we're digging back a ways.
Yeah, I do remember like seeing the first movie as a kid and thinking the tech was really interesting and cool. The look was cool. Um, I didn't start processing sort of the dialogue and some of the plot points and some ways that it might relate to philosophy, theology a little bit until I watched it later in life. And then there was the second movie that came
Yeah.
out. What was it, 2015 or no? It was earlier than that, wasn't it?
Um,
Uh,
it's around there.
yeah,
2010.
yeah, 5 years late. Okay, okay.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and I really enjoyed the second movie quite a bit. I found
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
surprisingly good. Um, and
Not as good of quality of graphics in the 82 version.
yeah, they were
Um,
they were really pushing the tech back then, even
yeah.
though it doesn't age as well. But anyways,
It held up though in one regard. So we talked about this, and then I just happened to have a little bit of time, and I watched it today, and I was surprised. I was surprised. It actually was enjoyable, despite the fact that I'm like, all right, I know that disc they're just putting on their back is a frisbee that's been, it's got like some reflective tape put on it
yeah,
and all that. They filmed those scenes in black and white, and then did some rotoscoping and all that good stuff. But
yeah. So what was your like experience of it today? Like we usually will talk about movies and we'll talk about the relationship to Christian theology, if any, or lack thereof, or disconnects. What stood out to you this time around?
yeah, so I would say, uh, there's a few takeaways, big takeaways. I mean, we talked about this last week. The hero journey. It's very clear that there's a hero journey in this story.
Hmm.
Um, and you could almost say there's simultaneously two hero stories. You've got the character Tron, who
Yep.
is a program inside of uh, this computer world, who eventually he fights for the user, right? And eventually he sacrifices himself, or appears to sacrifice himself. And as well, um, Kevin Flynn, the user, he as well kind of goes on a journey of discovery and all this kind of stuff, and ends up being willing to sacrifice himself.
So it's interesting. There's like two. It's like there's two savior figures, and there's two different ways you can see a Christ theme there, I suppose. Because
Yeah.
in the one sense, um, well, I don't know. Like Tron, it is like a reflection of a person in the real world. It's like you have
Hmm.
the actors, the characters in the outside world, and then you have like reflections of them who
Yeah.
pop up in the world, and then you have like the literal human entering his creation.
Yeah. Yeah,
Um,
that's a very clear allegorical image that stood out. You've got Kevin Flynn, who is a computer programmer in the real world, and he enters in to the digital world,
mhm.
and I guess you could make the argument. This is where some of the allegory breaks down a little bit. He didn't really enter it by choice, um, whereas Christ entered the world obviously by choice.
Yep.
But it still paints this picture of the hero being willing to sacrifice himself, and what they're fighting for is essentially like a free digital world.
Yeah.
Less constraint.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I noticed the dialogue between like there's the people sort of looking for this potential coming of a user, and then there's people who say,
Hmm.
"Well, I don't believe in users."
Yeah.
I remember that struck me as sort of like someone starting to look at these kinds of things in movies, looking for these themes as like a Bible college student. When I finally saw it again, I think I was like, "Oh, that's surprisingly strong allegory for a Disney movie."
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
at one point, what's the name of the computer? The program,
yep,
uh, Stark or something like that. It actually, I read one article that said that it's the Greek word for the flesh.
interesting.
Um, Interesting. But
Oh, that's
he's
true.
kind of
My Greek is like unusably rusty, but I think I remember
yeah,
that.
no, me too.
Yeah.
But he
Like I've said before, my Greek, I know enough Greek to know when a preacher's BSing me about how much Greek they know, but that doesn't mean I know a lot. But
you notice I stopped using any any Greek in my messages.
yeah. Mm,
Like, oh great, he's on to me.
yeah.
Uh, but but this guy actually says at one point, if you're one of those religious, followers, you're going to basically get substandard training.
Right.
We're not putting up with you religious folk.
Yeah, you're religious if you, and it is an interesting, like that's an interesting sort of apologetic argument, sort of parallel in that like the obviousness of intelligent, the intelligent nature of creation, and that like these computer programs who are self-aware saying they don't believe they were created, and it's like we're
Yeah.
far more complex than a computer, but we don't think we were created.
Mm.
It's that's interesting.
Yeah.
Um, yeah. So any more themes in the first one? I don't know how eager we are to jump into the second one yet. Like, I mean, I have some thoughts there that because I saw that more recently. You just rewatched the first one today.
Yeah. Yeah.
I just rewatched the second one like last week or a little earlier than that. But yeah.
Yeah. There's a couple thoughts. So there's a remnant. That's kind of a if you're a, a church person, that might be especially if you're a dispensationalist, that might be something that you're familiar with as far as a term. Uh, in the Old Testament, we constantly hear, like
Well, I think
this discussion.
Calvinists understand the vocabulary of
Do they?
remnant as
Okay,
well. That's the
good,
Pauline
good.
Romans.
There we go.
Yeah.
But in the Old Testament, we actually hear it a lot. God has saved for himself a remnant. That's not any particular scripture I'm quoting. That's just me saying that.
Romans
Um,
11.
okay. We see that in this movie. Like there's this remnant of computer programs that believes the user is coming. You mentioned that already. And the way that they show them throughout the film is kind of like they are hoping for this coming user who's going to liberate them and bring freedom. And they're doing everything they can to um, prepare the way, to anticipate
All right, so
all that kind
my
of stuff.
brain is a little foggy tonight. Are you shifting to the second movie talking about
No, this
this?
is the first one. I'm
The
not.
one
I'm only talking about the first one.
because this is reminding me of some themes in the second one too. But go ahead.
Yeah, I think some of it. So I read a synopsis of the second one because it has been a couple of years since I've seen it. And I think that is one of the themes that carried over into the second one.
Yeah.
Um, but we can get there in a moment. In the first one, there's this. It's not a very clear cut. Like you have to kind of look into it a bit to see it. But
Hmm.
there's a group of people who are kind of anticipating the coming of the user, and at the end, right before Master Control is defeated, he has to be one of my favorite like CGI characters. The graphics are so terrible on him. Uh, but before that happens, he brings in this group of people. They're kind of like, I guess, other gatekeeper type programs, and they're considered like the religious zealots, and they're pinned against the wall. And he's going to basically destroy them, and they're going to watch as he absorbs them into himself and begins to assert more control over all of the whatever. That I won't call it the internet. I think of the internet when I see this, but the computer world, the digital world.
Hmm.
So
The grid.
the grid. Yeah, it
Yes.
becomes the grid in the second film.
Did they not call it that in the first one? I can't remember.
I didn't catch it being called the grid in the first one. So maybe if someone wants to comment, if they know more
Yeah.
than I do, whether it was called the grid.
Yeah. 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 Now the second one. Now this is just sort of an atmosphere gut kind of feeling, but I wouldn't be surprised if I saw some analysis and someone pointed out that maybe they put some Eastern religious themes into it.
Yeah.
Like what's the lead actor's name?
Is it Jeff Bridges?
Jeff Bridges. Yeah, yeah. He sort of does the whole like he's got his whole Zen meditation thing going on, but it's like an aesthetic thing. I don't know how explicit
Yeah.
the themes get in that regard, but it is interesting the way the themes that stuck out to me that made me they didn't strike me as like, oh, that's a Christian theme, but it struck me as, oh, that's starts up a conversation among Christians about, like, for instance, the nature of creation and the way that the will and the autonomy of the creation manifests in relationship to God. That's a debate that the movie could spark among Christians.
Mm. Yeah.
So do you remember like when Jeff Bridges is talking to his son? Now there's a theme we could talk about, his son coming, and
Yeah. Sam.
however you want to interpret that. Maybe we will, but when he's talking to him about, like, well, um, where did these, what do you call them, the ISOs?
Yeah. The ISOs.
Yeah, they come and it's like, wow, you made them. He says, no, they manifested,
Hmm.
right? And so there is this, like, lack of control that the creator has over his creation. It just sort of manifests and has a presence there. But then also, like, the way in which, like, he has his mirrored self
Hmm.
to help him with creation, and it rebels. It's sort of a Satan parallel, I suppose.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there is sort of the way it's sort of like the parallels are there, but they're also limited, particularly if you have a high view of the sovereignty of God and the plan of God. It's very much like God's kind of, if you see Jeff Bridges as the God character and Sam as the son character or something like that, there is, like, that limitation of uh, if you extend the allegory too much, there's obviously going to be some serious tampering with God's attributes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
For sure.
yeah.
Well, I think that's true of any allegorical
True. I had a conversation with
story.
I had a conversation with Doug Tenaple early on in my gaming channel life. Do you know who Doug Tenaple is?
I seem to remember this video.
Yeah,
Is
he created the character of Earthworm Jim,
Yeah. Yeah.
and he created my favorite PC puzzle game in the '90s, the Neverhood. And I asked him about it. I'm like, if I took your allegory too seriously, like, there's a part where the God character, like, he is a Christian.
Hmm.
Doug Tenaple is, but I'm like, I'm not sure he was familiar with the vocabulary between open theism and Molinism and stuff. But we decided to have a Calvinism debate for, like, probably it took up, like, at least a third or a half of the video, because he was like, oh yeah, we got to make this interesting, let's argue about this. I was like, okay. But, like, I asked him about the Neverhood. There's, like, an allegory, and it's a clear Christian allegory. He totally did it on purpose. But the God character is basically hoodwinked by Satan. And I'm like, if I took that literally, I'd have to be an open theist, because God didn't see X, Y, or Z coming.
Mm.
And he goes, I'm a little bit of an open theist. But then when I probed, I'm like, he didn't, he was actually trying to say he's a Molinist.
Okay.
I don't think he understood, but then he kind of defended open theism a little bit. So it was like a little bit, but then he talked about all the authors he likes, and he liked a lot of Calvinistic ones. But anyways, that's that was an interesting discussion. But all that to say, like, I don't think even he would say that he's trying to, like, I'm not saying that the Tron creators were Christians. I have no idea.
Right.
I think they have a lot of philosophical awareness and
Yeah, I
things like
think
that.
so. So the
Um,
guy that wrote it, I tried to do a little digging on
yes, I did
that
not dig.
regard.
Tell me what you found.
He comes from a mostly Jewish background, but he would describe it as kind of half Jewish, half Christian.
Interesting.
But I couldn't really find more than that. It could have been because of limited time.
Hmm.
I had to take care of changing a diaper and a few things like that. So
Yep.
the joys of fatherhood on
Uh-huh.
a Friday afternoon. But yeah, so he comes from a religious influence background. I don't believe he is a Christian,
Hmm.
but he's an interesting writer. I think he's very philosophical, and while he had some other movies that he had worked on, I don't know if I would really consider him to have been like a really successful director and writer. Definitely more successful than I've ever been at that career. But
Let
um, you know, uh,
me know when you've got Jeff Bridges in one of your projects.
exactly. Um, Yeah, but I feel kind of bad for the guy in one regard because it's like here was a movie Tron that, in my opinion, should have done better than it did, and
Yeah.
it's become kind of a cult classic after the fact. It did not do well in the theaters,
Right.
and I always feel bad when that happens because it was a really compelling story, a
Hmm.
great film. and it spawned a great sequel. So it could have done better, should have done better. But I think there's definitely a lot of philosophical influence and some religious influence.
It's pretty clear, yeah. Yeah. So any other thoughts on that before we do a little
Uh,
trivia?
yeah, I think at the end of the day, something we've mentioned before, there is only one great story, and everything else just mirrors and tries to retell that story, even when not intentional. Um, and that is the story that we see in scriptures, the story of redemption, God sending his son into a sin destroyed world to redeem for himself a people. And it's from there that storytelling is really becomes a thing. It becomes an art form. It becomes something that we creations,
Mhm.
us creatures, um, we do, and it really finds its origin in that. And
Mhm.
um, I'm sure some may disagree, but that's what I hold to, anyways. And
Yeah.
they're all trying to tell the greatest story ever told.
Yeah, I would uh I'll have to send it to you. I remember it was during a Desiring God conference. Doug Wilson gave a sermon talk. It was actually technically a chapter of a book that they were basically compiling and presenting in this conference on C.S. Lewis.
Mm,
But his chapter was on how reformed or not reformed C.S. Lewis was.
yeah.
It was fascinating. He called it Undragoned,
Mm,
um, the name of the talk, and his view was C.S. Lewis was probably more aware of Reformed theology than we are because he was, Church of England. He was very aware of, what was it, the 39 articles? Is that what it's called? I can't remember the number of them,
I
but
feel like we'll get into that in a moment.
we may, but he basically makes the point. Um, yeah, he doesn't straight up say like C.S. Lewis was a fully intentional 5 point Calvinist, blah blah blah. But he's like he was aware of it, and you can see these themes in Narnia, different in such and such. But then he goes, storytellers are functional Calvinists,
Mm,
whether they would call themselves that or not.
interesting.
In that we are imitating God in His writing of the world when we write.
Yeah.
Um, and basically, his point is to encourage like Christian authors to take more authority over the worlds they create. It's a really interesting
Yeah.
talk, but
I as a reader, I would like that more in general, like
mhm,
the what you just described there, taking more authority over the worlds that they create, because it's like sometimes I feel like it's just not done well,
yeah,
especially in more recent Christian fiction, and even just fiction in general. I do tend to read more regular fiction than I read Christian fiction. To be clear, I
uh-huh,
feel like that'll come up at some point.
yeah.
But yeah, I feel like oftentimes one of the default
You know what that means?
areas.
Blasphemy!
I'm 4 for 4 with that.
Hey,
Um,
no.
uh, I think just in general,
I'm being ironic. I'm being
I
ironic.
know, I know. I think in
What's
general,
wrong with you
Christian
people?
authors, Christian writers, Christian creators tend to go with um, what sells, and sometimes that is kind of putting like sugar on the shelf. You know, like you fill something with sugar, kids are going to eat it.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think that tends to come out in what is written and the books that are put out, the movies that are put out for Christians. And
Hmm.
I just would rather see some compelling storytelling. And
Yeah.
and I think if people would take ownership of the worlds that they're creating in the books they're writing, in the movies they're creating, we might have something that's actually pretty good.
Ash agrees with you, Caleb.
Well, thank you, Ash.
Yes. Um, yeah, I had like a half baked thought before about Doug TenNapel, but the point I was making was um, he he clearly put Christian themes in his work, and
Hmm.
he told me about how intentional it was. Um, but whether he would have defended open theism or not or whatever, my point was, even if we see like in a Tron or in an explicitly Christian author creating something, and we see a theme that is an imperfect or limited allegory, where if you were to take the characters and literally read them up into a god theme, like we shouldn't dismiss it because it's limited in its
Right.
application. In that, like, the Neverhood, my favorite video game, which clearly has Christian parallels, it clearly has a god character, it clearly has a like an Adam character, it has a Satan character, but there's non-parallels as well in ways it breaks away. And I feel like when a Christian sees a partial parallel, they dismiss it. But I think you need to you need to be aware of the themes that are there, but you also need to let that story in and of itself breathe.
Yeah.
You know, and because that it's its own story as well. There's parallels, but it's like that world has to breathe and be what it is.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyways, that was my half-baked thought finished, if it makes sense.
Very, very good.